So while it took a little bit of time, I finally finished collecting every single Codex of Power aspect that the Necromancer can gain access to. What I thought might be useful is, based off of the hundreds of hours that I now have on the Necromancer, kind of give them a rating 1 through 10 between the early game and the late game, and how valuable or useful I think that these are in general, so you have a better understanding of which ones are good to go for and which ones you can kind of ignore until later when you're just trying to complete everything and get your renown done. Just for people who are new, there are 5 types of aspects. There are defensive, offensive, resource, utility, and mobility. Defensives can be put onto a shield, a helmet, a chest armor, pants, and your amulet. Offensive can be put onto the amulet, weapon, gloves, and rings. Resources can be put onto rings. Utility can be put onto just about everything, so shield, helmet, chest armor, amulet, gloves, and boots. And then mobility can be put onto amulets and boots. So you'll see that other than resource, every single type of aspect can be put onto an amulet. And the reason why that's so powerful is because the amulet actually gives you an additional 50% bonus to any of the variables that are in your roll. And anything that gets put onto a two-handed weapon gains a 100% bonus to the effects that you would have on it. But starting in the defensive aspects, we have Aspect of the Protector. This one's a really early game version of a pretty nice survivability tool. Honestly, I rate this thing 10 out of 10. I think it does exactly what it says on the tin, and it's so good in the early game for being able to generate additional survivability that I think it will typically get overlooked. Now, it definitely doesn't scale into the end game, but I think it's all in all a pretty solid aspect. Aspect of Might says that whenever you use a basic skill, you gain 20% damage reduction for 2 seconds. So this basically means in the super early game, whenever you're generating resource where you typically have to stand still to be able to do that, you won't just immediately get gacked, you'll be able to survive longer. Oh no, I say this is about a 5 out of 10 as far as defensive aspects are concerned. Yes, you would use it if you have nothing else, but realistically, 2 seconds of 20% damage reduction. Eventually, later on, you're not even really using basic skills or generators, so the chances to get this bonus kind of diminish very quickly. But on builds that fight close, like lunging strike Barbarian as a generator or basic skill, this is incredibly powerful so that you can withstand getting back into a fight and being able to drop the rest of your damage for longer. Aspect of Disobedience says that you gain 0.25% increased armor for 4 seconds when you deal any type of damage, and this can stack 100 times, up to 25%. This one is probably more like an 8 out of 10 for survivability, because it's just nice to gain additional armor. Since armor in this game decreases all damage that you take, it applies to your elemental resistances as well as your physical damage reduction. And then Aspect of Deflecting Barrier, which I would rate a 0 out of 10 if I could, says that while you have a barrier active, there's a 7% chance to ignore incoming direct damage from distant enemies. Again, if you literally have nothing else, you might as well throw this on. If you happen to be using the Protector, it can help to kind of act like a dodge type effect for incoming distant damage. And I'd just like to note that the Necromancer themselves doesn't have any unique defensive aspects, and that's how you know you're dealing with a Giga Chad class, because none of their Codex of Power aspects are trying to save their life. They're really only trying to do damage. Now this one's a long list. I'm going to try to get through them a little bit faster than I just did with the defensive ones. Aspect of Bursting Bones is absolute trash. There's technically a world where this counts as multiple instances of doing damage, so you can proc other stuff, but you just literally will never use this. Splintering aspect is 100 out of 10, the best Codex of Power aspect bar none. This thing is absolutely bananas. It says that Bone Spear now applies vulnerable to every target, meaning you don't even have to use the modifier that says that applies it to the first target. It also deals additional damage with the shards that shoot out of it to vulnerable targets, and now your shards can pierce as opposed to just hitting a single target. This upwards of 3 times multiplies your overall damage output on Bone Spear. And it's so good that I actually run 1 point Bone Spear on a Bone Spirit build just to be able to apply vulnerable with a single cast because of this aspect in the endgame in World Tier 4. That's how crazy this thing is. Blighted aspect is just as crazy as what I was just talking about. It's just a little bit harder to understand how it works, but it gives you a 50% damage bonus for 6 seconds after your Shadow Blight passive has successfully dealt damage 10 times to 10 targets. While it's hard to kind of quantify that, I actually fit this aspect and that key passive in on the vast majority of my endgame Necromancer builds, even when they're not shadow damage builds, because it's so easy to proc this. And when you put it onto a two-handed weapon on a max roll, it says 240% multiplicative damage for 6 seconds, and it's up every 12 seconds. So it's basically like having 120% multiplicative damage up the entire time during a fight. It is nutty. Another 1000 out of 10. This thing is super, super powerful and will probably be overlooked unless I have something to say about it. Edgemasters is about a 3 to 5 out of 10. It basically says when you're at 100% resource, you gain 10% damage, and then when you use a skill, now you're at 80% resource, you gain 8% damage. It's a nice flat multiplier if you have nothing else available to you, but it doesn't really add so much to it that I would think it would really be worth it. On an amulet it says 15, on a 200 weapon it says 20, and that's kind of okay if you have nothing else going for you. Bloodseeker's aspect would be really good, like 8 out of 10 if Bloodlance was actually a skill, but because Bloodlance isn't actually a skill, this is 1 out of 10, absolutely useless. It says that Bloodlance will deal additional damage to the primary target every time that you lance another target. The problem being that Bloodlance and lancing other targets is complete garbage, so it kind of doesn't matter. But on a Bloodlance build, it's necessary. Aspect of Grasping Veins is another 10 out of 10 aspect. This goes on to literally every single build that can deal critical strike damage. When you cast Corpse Tendrils, it gives you 10% chance to crit for 6 seconds, which is huge, especially on non-bone builds that find it harder to be able to stack crit. Then you also deal 30% additional critical strike damage, so it gives you the tools to crit and then increases the damage that you crit. It's just ridiculous. I wouldn't say it's 1000 out of 10 because it's just a bit more vanilla than the other ones, but this is an auto include somewhere on your build, typically on a ring, so you don't have to replace it as often, and you will use this forever. Sacrificial says that your sacrifice bonuses are increased by 15%, and you might think like, oh, that's like a huge amount, but you have to remember that it's a multiplier of 15%. So sacrificing your skirmishers gets you 5% chance to crit. 15% of 5% is 0.75%. So putting this on increases your chance to crit by less than 1%. So it's not as powerful as you may think it is. Now that being said, it does apply to all sacrifice bonuses, whereas a lot of other things only specify the skeleton sacrifice bonuses. So this does also increase critical strike damage from your golem, which is at 30%. So that actually gets you 4.5% critical strike damage. And when you add all those things up, it probably amounts to roughly 10% more effective bonus from your sacrifices, which is pretty decent. I wish it wasn't an offensive aspect, so that drops it down to about a 6 out of 10, but it's definitely good enough if you don't have anything else going for you. Needleflare is trash, I'm sorry. Thorns is trash, I'm sorry. If you're a Thorns build, you gotta use it, but 0 out of 10, Thorns is bad. Aspect of the Dam, equally bad. It says you deal 30% increased shadow damage if you have both of your curses on targets. Right now, I am not using curses on any Necromancer builds. I think that they are subpar in the vast comparison to anything else that you could use. Blood Mist is a necessary skill on every single build. Corpse Tendrils is a necessary skill on every build. I think that Corpse Explosion gets used on every single build, and that leaves you a Generator, a Spender, and then a single other skill, and I don't think you're ever going to fit in 2 curses, even on like a support Necromancer build. Aspect of Spelling Curse is a little specialized since it only applies to Bone Spirit, but it is a pretty nice damage modifier. Basically says that if you cast Bone Spirit from anywhere outside of melee range, you just get an additional multiplier on it, and since there is a way of generating a ton of free Bone Spirits, it is a nice way to just amp up their damage as well, but it's super specialized, so it's somewhere around a 4 out of 10. And again, it's kind of low, so I don't think it takes the place of any other better scaling aspects, but if you're a Bone Spirit build, you'll probably use this for a while. Rapid aspect is actually pretty nice, especially in the early game. I think in the early game, it's somewhere around like a 9 out of 10, and in the late game, it's probably a 0 out of 10 because you're not going to use it. But your basic skill, which is your generator skill, gains attack speed, means that you generate resource faster, means that you go back to dealing damage faster, and that really can't be overstated how valuable that is. Reanimation is nice if you're a summoner build. Sadly, summoner builds are absolute garbage, although some of them kind of work, so I definitely think it's an auto include on those, so somewhere around an 8 out of 10, but it doesn't apply to your golem, which is one of the reasons why I think that this is kind of trash. I really wish that everything that applied to minions just applied to all minions, and we weren't juggling between skeletons and golem for different types of boons here. Unyielding Commander's aspect would be the strongest aspect in the game for a niche build if Army of the Dead was a skill that you would actually use. This thing is bananas. Your minions gain 70% attack speed and take 90% reduced damage for the length of Army of the Dead. Army of the Dead lasts for 7 seconds and does absolutely nothing else. So realistically, I don't see any build that actually uses this skill, even for pure utility. I'd rather have Bones Torn up, gain myself damage reduction and critical strike chance, and have my minions gain 30% of those stats than use this. But if there's ever a world where they retune Army of the Dead to actually be a skill that would be used, this thing would absolutely go off the charts. Plunging Darkness is sneakily an incredibly valuable aspect. It says that when you use Bone Prison, it also spawns a pool of blight underneath it. And there are other aspects that say when you spawn Blight, it pulls in monsters to it as a pixel pull. So now your Bone Prison pulls in monsters to its center and begins dealing darkness damage over it. That's actually an increased bonus to your typical Blight damage. So on any Blight build, this is just like a free, more powerful, applying vulnerable version of Blight, since that's what Bone Prison typically does. It also generates you a bunch of essence. 10 out of 10 aspect. I don't think enough people are going to use it at first because it's kind of difficult to conceptualize it, but I highly recommend it. Intercom says that you deal more damage for the amount of time that you stand still, upwards of 30%. And it turns out, especially in the early game, there are a lot of times when you're kind of just standing there generating essence and then spending essence. So it's actually one of the stronger overall multipliers that you can get. On top of that, the damage value that you increase also increases your minions damage. So if you're more of a stand back, kind of decompose and blight summoner, you can just increase their damage as well because you don't necessarily have to move as much. So I say this is somewhere around like 6 or 7 out of 10. The only problem is that you can't really rely on having the damage because you can't assume that you'll never have to move. And in those cases, I kind of don't like it, but the rate at which it ticks up is actually very fast. It's not like it waits 6 seconds and then you get the boost. It's constantly adding up. So at any given time, you're kind of hovering between like 5 to 20% additional damage, and that's like kind of good enough. Blood Bathed is absolutely the auto include for Blood Surge. The only problem is that Blood Surge is kind of it's kind of iffy, it's kind of meh. That being said, Blood Bathed does help a ton to be able to increase its overall damage output and kind of smooth out its transition into a mid-game or like mid-tier build. So for that build, 10 out of 10, auto include. Aspect of Retribution starts off by saying completely useless garbage, and then says just like basically free 20% damage. So it starts off by saying distant enemies have an 8% chance to be stunned if they hit you, which is just like, why have we put this many caveats into an ability? Why can't it just say like knock back ranged enemies or apply a half-second stun when ranged enemies hit you? I don't think that that would be absolutely ridiculous. But it also says that you deal 20% additional damage to stunned monsters. And since Corpse Tendrils applies stun when it pulls monsters in, you are gonna run Corpse Tendrils on every single build. So you can run this 20% damage modifier when you have Corpse Tendrils up on every single build. It's an auto include across the board. It's one of the least difficult to get the bonus of damage modifiers that's actually available in the Codex of Power at this point. Empowering Reaper is in this weird place where early on it's a 0 out of 10 aspect, but later on it has a chance of bumping up to like a 6 out of 10 aspect, and it adds a really interesting utility to a build that otherwise wouldn't have it. It says that Sever has a small chance to proc Blight under a target that deals bonus damage, and this can only happen once every 3 seconds. Now Sever does do 4 instances of damage, so it is 4 rolls of 10%. The only caveat is that you also have to crit with the Sever attack. And to get the biggest bonus out of Blight, you would need to put 5 points into Blight and pick up the 2 other points for the enhancement and the modifier of Blight to make it apply slow and immobilize. But in a world where you're like pure darkness, but you want to be able to spam critical strike skills like Sever, but still get the added AoE bonus of Blight, this kind of puts it both into one. But in the early game, it's not going to proc altogether that much because it's 10% of the time that you crit, and darkness builds have kind of a hard time stacking crit in the early game. So I don't know, 0 out of 10 to start, and then like 8 out of 10, depending on how wacky those builds get. And then this one's just nice. Attacking enemies with a basic skill increases your core skill damage, which is the typical loop in the beginning of the game. So attacking with your basic skill to get your resource increases your core skill damage when you spend it. Pretty simple. I think this kind of fits onto every single build. This is in Skosglen, so it's in the second act of the game. So you'll get it fairly soon into your completion of the campaign, and you kind of just toss this onto whatever slot you're going to use and not replace that often because you're probably going to keep using this for a long time. 10 out of 10, great aspect. Just keep in mind that resource generation aspects can only go on your rings, so these are going to be really picky of whether or not they're good enough. First one says that blood orbs reduce your ultimate cooldown by 0.5 seconds. This is just kind of like not good enough. There's kind of a world where you would use this on an endgame free Bone Spirit Blood Orb build that wants to keep maximum uptime on Bone Storm. But now we're talking about taking up a ring slot and not generating resource from it, which I just think is really hard for most builds to kind of handle unless they have a really efficient vehicle or engine somewhere else in their build. Maybe it's always a 0 out of 10, even in the endgame. It's hard to tell with this one. Hulking Aspect says a lot of words, but basically what it means is that the golem has a chance to reduce its active cooldown, and that it also has a chance to spawn a corpse whenever it deals damage. This is trash. 0 out of 10. Golems are decent utility tools on some Necromancers, and they're kind of okay on some other builds that don't have every single skill that they want yet. But the golem reducing its own cooldowns means that you don't really know when you can and cannot use your golem's active ability. And then a very small chance to spawn a corpse whenever it attacks is just kind of not useful enough, since there's a bone golem that just says basically every other time it gets hit, generate a corpse. And in general, you're the one generating most of your corpses. So 0 out of 10, I don't really understand what this thing is supposed to be doing. Requiem Aspect is kind of nice. It says you gain 3 maximum essence per active minion. This really only fits into some type of bone minion build, which I don't really think can afford to run minions in any way, shape, or form. Where this would benefit the most would be on Bone Spirit that wants to have as much essence as possible, but now you're taking up a bunch of slots just to have essence, as opposed to being able to generate essence, which is the primary concern of a Bone Spirit build. So 5 out of 10, like, it's not terrible, but 0 out of 10, I don't think it really gets used in any builds. The moment that you get past level 5, I'm just going to generally call this a 0 out of 10. I don't really think that the game has a play style that requires this for it to actually have a use, but it's in a good place so that if they ever change that, it'll already be there for you. Fleshrending says that after your Decompose spawns a corpse, you gain 10 essence, which is pretty nice. A lot of people like using Decompose, and I think if you're completely standing still channeling Decompose, you've already made a massive mistake in how to play the Necromancer. So it's good for people who want to use Decompose, and for there it's very efficient. So I'd give this like an 8 out of 10. But I would just recommend really considering using any other generator or any other engine on the Necromancer than the Decompose channel one, because it doesn't do damage. It kind of increases minion damage, which is KEKW laughable, and the amount of corpses that it generates just isn't as efficient as just about every other option that you have for the Necro. Aspect of Torment is 10 out of 10 include on every bone build. It says that critical strikes with bone skills increase your essence generation by 20%. That's just nice. It's like grabbing a whole bunch of willpower all of a sudden, and it's a really good way to be able to help maintain a constant flow of essence as opposed to getting instant stabs of essence. So you can kind of maintain casting Bone Spear more often, and also maintain casting Bone Spirit whenever it's up off of cooldown. Potent Blood, on the other hand, from Fastblood, is a fantastic aspect. It says when you're at full life, blood orbs grant 10 essence. So not only are there a ton of overhealing potential on the Necromancer that gets you benefits depending on what the gear you have, but also now if you are at max life but you have a bunch of blood orbs around you, picking them up is going to refill your essence orb, and that's just nice. Even if it only procs like once or twice per fight, getting back 20 essence basically for free on any build that generates blood orbs is just super good. So 10 out of 10 auto include on anything that generates blood orbs. And then we have Umbral, 100,000 out of 10 best resource generating aspect in the game at this point, and hell, I'm still using it in tier 4. It says that you restore 1 of your primary resource, so for the Necromancer essence, every time you apply crowd control to an enemy, even if that enemy already has that crowd control on it. So if you use Corpse Tendrils, which applies slow to every monster within range, and you hit 10 monsters, that's 10 essence. Then when it pulls it in and applies stun, that's 10 more instances of crowd control, and that's 10 more essence. So hitting 10 monsters with Corpse Tendrils alone generates 20 essence for free. It cannot be overstated just how incredibly powerful Umbral is, and you are literally going to see endgame builds still running this until they have hyper specialized gear. So I'm going to drop this onto a really good ring and basically never replace that thing until I'm level 100. That's how good this aspect is. For the utility aspects, these ones get, yeah, they're kind of meh. So enemies afflicted by your Iron Maiden have a 15% chance to be stunned for 1 second when they deal direct damage. The irony here is that other than using Iron Maiden really just as a mana battery, Iron Maiden is supposed to cause monsters to return damage to you, and monsters can only return damage to you if you can attack, and they can't attack if they're stunned. So this thing basically says turn off the primary use of Iron Maiden, and I find that incredibly ironic and funny, so 0 out of 10 straight garbage. Shared Misery says lucky hit chance. When you hit a crowd control enemy, there's a 30% chance that that crowd control effect will spread to another unaffected enemy. So crowd control effects are things like chill, freeze, stun, knocked back, knocked down, immobilized, these types of ideas. So if you can apply a stun to a monster and you hit them, you have a lucky hit chance to be able to then stun another monster for free. So in some worlds with Umbral, this is a really good way to get additional free resource if you don't have anything else to put on your ring. But I think that it's like too niche, too specific. It might also have some really interesting uses in PvP or group PvP, so I can't really speak to that, but all in all, I think it's somewhere around like a 3 out of 10. I would use it if I had nothing else, but I don't think that it procs often enough that it's really worth even spending the gold and the resources to put it onto something. Eluding Aspect is actually just like really good. What it says is when you become injured while crowd controlled, you gain Unstoppable, and this can only happen once every 40 seconds. It's a little bit like a get out of jail free ability, like you just got stunned and there's a big monster winding up a huge attack like the Khazra Goatmen, and something else manages to hit you. You become injured and now you're unstoppable, you can move. There are other things that also say when you become unstoppable, gain movement, speed, etc. So it's nice. It's not going to save your life in a lot of different scenarios, but especially earlier on where monsters aren't typically one hitting you and you don't really have a lot of unstoppable options, especially on the Necromancer until you get Blood Mist. This is a pseudo get out of jail free card. Because of that, it's kind of like an 8 out of 10. I would toss it on if I had nothing else, but you will very quickly end up replacing this with something more valuable. For mobility, we have the exact thing I was just talking about with Ghostwalker. It says while unstoppable, and for 4 seconds after you gain movement speed. So ironically enough, this is one of the few ways that the Necromancer can actually gain movement speed, because after you use Blood Mist to move away from a dangerous area, you will have 10% increased movement speed for 4 seconds after. Now, you would also need the aspect that says that you aren't slowed down while using Blood Mist. Since Blood Mist reduces your movement speed by 20%, this just kind of offsets that a little bit and then net positives later on when you're done with your Blood Mist animation. But now we're talking about using two different aspects together, and you have to get lucky and drop one of them, and now you kind of have a movement ability on the Necromancer. But honestly, in the early game, that might be good enough to warrant using this and the other aspect, especially since you can't really be picky and choosy when you don't have a lot of options to start with. As one of the few ways that the Necromancer can actually gain movement speed, it's kind of 10 out of 10, and in most other scenarios, it's more like a 3 or 4 out of 10. I would definitely use it, especially before I have Blood Mist, and even when I have Blood Mist, just to give myself another chance to be able to survive stuff. But ultimately, you're definitely going to replace this one. And then Windstriker aspect, 10 out of 10. It says every time that you crit, you get 8% movement speed for 1 second. That might not sound like a lot, but a lot of different builds on the Necromancer have tons of AoE damage that are able to crit multiple times, and this stacks up to 6 seconds. So there are opportunities where I run in, use Bone Spear one time, crit 5 or 6 times, and now I'm moving on from that pack of monsters with 8% movement speed for a total of 6 seconds, and that's really, really good. Again, Necromancer has basically no movement speed at all, and anything that you can get to speed yourself up is incredibly important. So 10 out of 10. I use this even right now. I just want to make sure I'm not lying. Right there, I actually got a better version of it that dropped on these greaves, so now I gain 11% movement speed for upwards of 6 seconds whenever I cast Bone Spear, and you really feel that movement speed considering we have almost nothing else. And just to kind of show you I'm not blowing smoke here, this is my level 61 Necromancer. I'm in World Tier 4, and I just wanted to show you how many Codex of Power Aspects that I'm still using at this point. So I'm still using of the Protector on my armor for that barrier. It's just nice to be able to have barrier, especially when the Butcher comes walking out, and the moment that I deal damage to him, I at least gain some barrier to buy myself some room. It's been really key in helping me stay alive. Using Grasping Veins on my gloves here for that Corpse Tendrils buff. As you just saw, using Windstriker on my boots for that movement speed when I crit. Using Splintering for that Bone Spear proc on my two-handed weapon. Using Torment here where my critical strikes with bone skills increase my essence regeneration. And using Umbral that I drop somewhere else so I actually have a 2 value for it. So all of those are Codex of Power aspects that you use. So even in the end game where you're still pushing, I'm pushing tier 20 Nightmare Dungeons at this point. I'm using all these aspects because they're kind of just that good. All in all, I'm really impressed with the aspects that are available in the Codex of Power and how build defining they are and how well they complement the different skills and the choices I'm making for my character's itemization as I play throughout the game. It's actually kind of expensive to put aspects onto your gear at first, but as you find more gear and you're able to salvage more gear and generate more gold, at this point I can kind of put whatever aspect I want on any piece of gear I want whenever I happen to find one. So don't worry, in the end game it gets really simple. I'd say somewhere around like level 30 to 40. I didn't really have to worry about resources so much, and sometimes I just had to be a little bit patient if I happened to try out too many builds and put too many different types of aspects on my weapons, then I had to go salvage more weapons just to give you an idea. But honestly, around that point, I really didn't have to worry about resources anymore. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope I managed to cut it down as much as I could. I didn't realize it was going to be that long, but there are a ton of great aspects with a lot of key information that I figure might be valuable for you to get your hands on, because I assume that you haven't had as many hours in the game as I had at this point, and I'd rather you be as equipped as possible so when you walk in, you're making good decisions and you're not wasting resources. So again, I hope that this helped. Consider leaving a comment and a like down on the video, and if you're new to the channel, consider subscribing. What are you doing? Come join the fam, be a part of this. Don't you want to hang out with our glowing purple necromancers? You know you do. Sorry, that's a little bit much. But again, thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope that it helps, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.